Third World War is not only inevitable, but is already taking place in new forms.
Painful trade-offs would be unavoidable.
The Ukraine war is accelerating the decline of the West.
We have enough nuclear megatonnage to set human life back to the Dark Ages.
I went to London to speak with David Betz, who's a military strategist and insurgency specialist at King's College in London. He wrote two very interesting papers that got my attention on the migration issue. He describes how Western governments are undermining their nations by bringing in migrants and favoring them over the indigenous populations. He points out the obvious that this will inherently lead to ethnic conflict and civil war.
My name's David Betz. I'm Professor of War in the Modern World in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. I had spent a long time studying insurgency and counterinsurgency in other places in the world, hot and dusty places abroad, and almost usually studying the involvement of my country or Western countries in the civil wars of other places on an expeditionary, essentially voluntary basis. And I suppose around 2016 it began to dawn on me that the conditions which the theory about civil war, about insurgency, which we were applying to states abroad, had a lot of resonance in our own domestic climate. I said 2016 for your listeners or your watchers. The important thing about that is I'm here in Britain, and that was the year in which the country had the Brexit reform, which was a highly contentious issue in British politics and in British social life for many years. The decision to leave the European Union was one which was almost primally offensive to 90% of our domestic power elite, which was very, very strongly on the side of remaining in the European Union. The Brexit referendum had something of the quality of a social revolt to it. If there was anything particularly clearly articulated by the referendum vote to leave, it was a rejection of elite politics. That's, I think, significant in itself. It became rather more significant in the years following as the British government, and with the connivance, it must be said, of the opposition parties and effectively the whole of the British bureaucracy, attempted then to subvert the referendum vote, in which effort they've largely succeeded. It struck me through those years that what the government was doing, in fact what our whole power elite was doing, was very, very dangerous. What it was very publicly accomplishing was the destruction of its own perceived legitimacy. Legitimacy is the magic that makes any consensual form of government work. It's very hard to describe actually what in fact legitimacy is. It's a term that's often employed in the scholarly literature, but rarely adequately defined. And I tend to refer to it as a kind of magic of government, because it does seem to, while it's hard to define, it's very clear when it is absent or present. When it's present, your cost of government is quite low, because people in a system which they believe to be legitimate tend to do the right thing without being policed or monitored or punished one way or the other, because they accept that the rules of the political game are followed fairly, and whether or not any particular decision taken is to their individual taste, they accept that the process has been legitimate. By contrast, when your legitimacy is low or absent, your costs of government go very high, because people have almost entirely the same responses in a system in which they perceive to be illegitimate, or even worse, to be invidious. They tend not to do the right thing. They tend to look for ways to achieve their aims outside of the political system, which in effect what an insurgency is. It is a social movement pursuing some form of change, which is forced by its inability to succeed within the existing rules of the game to go beyond the law. So I began to think that there were a set of problems existent in British society that were the same ones we took as warning signs in societies which you might think more commonly were prone to significant civil turmoil. Then I came to think that it wasn't just Britain that was in this state. Nearly all West European countries, and for somewhat different social and structural reasons, also the United States. And therefore, to conclude that this was a broader phenomenon, an ailment that had something to do with the condition of Western civilization at this point in its history. So that was about 2019, and I wrote a few academic papers on the subject at that time. It's typical of academic papers that they're rarely read. I was then asked in 2022 if I would participate in a conference on future war, which is a subject that I've written on quite a bit over the years. I thought I would write a paper for that conference, and to prepare for it I read a book called Anticipations by H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells is, as you probably know, a very famous science fiction author, let's say the original futurist, and Anticipations is one of his more important books. If I recall correctly, it was written in 1906, something like that. It has a series of chapters in it. One of those chapters is on war, where he talks about the future of war. There are 8 or 9 other chapters in the book. War is just one of his preoccupations. The interesting thing is, or the two interesting things about that book that struck me. Firstly, in the introduction, he explains that there are 2 ways of thinking about the future. One is that you start with a technological development, say the development of a new energy system or a new communication system, or like in contemporary times you might say let's start with the invention of the microprocessor and then work forward, kind of extrapolate where that technology might go as it gets cheaper and smaller and more powerful and so on and so forth. The other way you can do it, Wells says, is you try your best to understand the existing social condition in all its manifestations, economic, demographic, cultural. Essentially, let your imagination loose, project yourself forward some period of years, and on the basis of your understanding of where things are societally, rather than specifically technologically, then extrapolate, or just try to draw some informed speculation on what the future might hold. So I thought, well, why don't I do it the second way? Specifically, as I said, he does have a chapter in there on war, and it's the worst chapter in that book. Otherwise, Anticipations has lots of quite eerily accurate findings, but his chapter on war is almost funny in places because he gets it so spectacularly wrong. But it's also the only chapter in which he followed the technology extrapolation idea. All the other chapters, he follows let's call it the sociology route, or the social route. The war chapter is a technology chapter. I thought, well, why don't I just write the war chapter for H.G. Wells as though he had done it from a social perspective, according to his own method. And that led to a paper called The Future of War is Civil War. That's the one that most people have read of mine. But it caught attention because I was interviewed by a podcaster by the name of Louise Perry on her podcast Maiden, Mother, Matriarch, which I didn't know really anything about. But when she wrote a nice email asking if I would go on, I thought that could be interesting. Not exactly the core war studies audience, I thought. But in hindsight, I think it's quite significant why the listeners of a podcast called Maiden, Mother, Matriarch, which is concerned primarily with social issues, for her own reasons, she, as many other people, it must be said, in society, apprehend that there's something very, very wrong about how our societies are conformed, the way that they've gone. People are feeling angry, fundamentally, but apprehensive at the least. They have this apprehension that things have gone wrong. Some have the apprehension that things have been done to them that they didn't ask for, and that have compromised their well-being and their sense of the future. in a very serious way. So she arrived at something, I think it's fair to say that was something like her apprehension when she went onto the internet looking for someone who had written about future civil war and came across me. The most important factor in the current dilemma of Western societies is rapid pace of democratic change, which is historically unprecedented and which is imperiling the continued existence of national entities that have existed for many hundreds or 1,000 years or more. And that fact is simply jarring of people's basic sensibilities. There is a long-standing concept of the social contract, two basic ways of understanding what the social contract is. Conservative version of the social contract is the idea of a generational obligation between the people now living who have received from previous generations certain culture, assets. They have a responsibility to pass on intact that culture and the conditions that allowed them to thrive in their life. The basic reason that people are apprehensive about the future is that their societies are changing very, very rapidly as a result of mass migration into these countries, and specifically of people who are very difficult for the receiving society to integrate for a range of reasons we can go into, but people fear that they're losing their countries, by which they are losing some sense of historical continuity of relationship between a given place and a given people. And that is jarring to people because, on the whole, people do feel themselves to be attached to their places of origin, to be attached to their culture, to their language, to their land. It must be said, though, that these are ideas which are common amongst the mass of the population, but they are uncommon amongst the elite of Western societies, which is largely comprised of people who are suspicious of ideas such as I've just expressed, an attachment of a given people to a given land. They find this anachronistic, even morally suspicious. And therefore you have, as a result, a three-way conflict, a three-way struggle between the native population, which feels that it is losing its place, that it is being downgraded, that it is being displaced or replaced, as the popular version of the theory would put it. Is in conflict with its own elite, which is comprised almost entirely of people who are post-national in their orientation, who are educated and acculturated by habit to be skeptical of nation states. And you have another element being the non-native recent arrivals. All three are in tension with each other, and there is no obvious way in which that tension can be relieved in a non-traumatic manner.
Is the next war basically one between the government and the people?
Yes, one aspect of it is in the nature of a peasant revolt, which is a conservative revolt, essentially, where people are reacting against the perception that elites are changing the rules of the game in some way which is invidious to them. There are many factors which contribute to people's existing anger with elites. One could think of economic, a whole range of things one could complain about, but the most important, the most divisive, most corrosive, and therefore the most important is elite attitudes on migration, which have been very much at odds with those of street attitudes on migration since the end of the Second World War. Now we know this because we can look in the UK context, but you could do this in practically every Western country. If you look back over election manifestos of all those periods, you will not find the major parties are campaigning on the idea that they would push mass migration. When the political parties are campaigning, they talk of managed migration or indeed getting numbers down, because they understand that street is rather opposed to mass migration and has been for a long time. But what governments do is entirely the opposite, right? We have, in this case, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party in the UK have promised managed migration over and over, but each in power has presided over periods of migration with, 200,000 per year over a period of 15, 17 years apiece, right? And that's accelerating in the currently. I mean, if they could get the number to 200,000, they'd be claiming great success. So people feel that they've been betrayed, frankly, and there's good reason why they feel that. They also feel increasingly that voting doesn't matter, and they've come to that belief for perfectly obvious reasons. When you have election after election in which you are lied to, in which governments promise to do one thing and then do entirely the opposite thing, or indeed when governments, in the case of the Brexit referendum, ask a very specific question about the future direction of the country, and when they receive an answer which they dislike, actively and openly seek to subvert it. These things destroy people's sense that the system of politics works as a solution to collective action problems. I think Trump's election in 2016 is a manifestation in a somewhat different format of the same kinds of forces. I think the conclusion that it's all a charade is an accurate one, and one that many people are coming to, that what we have is a system of domestic political theater in which we have this kind of performative display, which we call elections, that don't actually change anything fundamental. And there's simply, that's not a wrong belief. The research is very clear that when there is a conflict between elite thinking on a given policy area and street thinking on the same area, elite always wins, no matter what the elections might say. So it's no surprise, therefore, that they surmise, therefore, the existence of something they call the uniparty. There are various less polite ways of putting it, but the idea being that there's not actually functionally much difference between the two, which again is a true statement. I think the policy is intentional. They wish to bring in large numbers of people, and again, we don't need to speculate wildly to come to this conclusion. You can simply listen to what Tony Blair and his advisors have publicly said about their intention to transform Britain through diversity, that their intention was to rub the right's noses in diversity and to permanently destroy the arguments of their political opposition via demographic transformation. This was perfectly openly stated. I'm sure they regret having stated it openly, but the fact of the matter is that it's out there. We don't have to speculate on this. We know this is the case. I think perhaps the scale of things has surprised even the elite. I'm not sure that Madame Merkel understood how significant was her decision on mass migration during her chancellorship. Honestly, she did seem to apprehend how serious it was. She made a famous speech on multiculturalism having been a disaster for Germany in 2012, if I recall correctly. To judge from the outside, I think there is as the Blair government put it, as I just mentioned, it's a way of permanently changing the political landscape of the country. It's an old joke that has been made reality, right? You can bring it, if you replace the voter. There's that aspect of it. I think also it's an expression of an ideal, of a mental attitude on the part of our elite, which tends to regard people not as citizens per se, but as sort of economic production units. If you're of the mind that running a society is essentially like running a balance sheet, or then what's important about one's nationality is what that says as a tax locator, and is much less obvious to people who think in this manner that there is any kind of important connection between people's identity and any particular place and time. After all, at the elite level, these are people who do tend to, be very mobile and are able to prosper more or less anywhere. The incentive, as you put it, is perhaps better described as a mindset, a way of looking at people that is primarily economic in its, or the way of looking at people, their nationality, which is something like the way in which, bankers look at sort codes and account numbers. Russia's always been actually a rather multi-ethnic empire, and there is a concept of Russian nationality which is different from Russian ethnicity, and so that's been the case in Russia for a long time. I'm not surprised that the same kind of apprehensions about being downgraded or displaced in one's homeland would also occur to them. It's a completely normal human reaction. The theories on Civil War causation that invoke this idea of downgrading are not culturally specific. They're just sort of referring to the tendency in any given society where you have a dominant majority that is fearful of losing its stature, has a heightened propensity to react, specifically to go to civil war. So if Russians perceive themselves to be in that position, then it would be reasonable to expect, given our theoretical understanding of how things are working, that they would react in the manner you described. There is potential for war with Russia. I think the primary potential for it lies in miscalculation. There is a long-standing political strategic gambit that sees governments which are threatened by very significant domestic turmoil, whether economic, social, or usually a mix of both, that perceive that their society is fracturing, becoming less and less cohesive, that fears that they are in danger of some serious revolt, to seek an external enemy. The existence of an external enemy has the tendency to provoke in-group consolidation. So if things are falling apart at home, this political strategic gambit which I've described sometimes leads leaders to seek foreign wars. Classic example of this is from Russia, actually, at the early part of the 20th century, in which it was hoped by a Russian minister, a Tsarist minister, that a short victorious war with Japan would have the effect of alleviating the revolutionary potential in that society. As it turns out, as probably everyone knows, the Russo-Japanese War did not go well for Russia, and the feared revolutionary tendencies also were not alleviated, although the big revolution, the big successful revolution, took another 12 years to materialize. So I think there is the potential, and actually I think the reality now is that the volume of political expressions about the Russian threat is mostly explicable by the fear of domestic. So I think it has potential, yes. And that will be tragic because it will be a very short war. It's no coincidence, rather, that when Boris Johnson goes to Kiev in April 22, I can't remember whether it was March or April, but 22, shortly after the invasion, at which point the Russians and Ukrainians are on the verge of settlement. And Johnson arrives to torpedo that. It's not a coincidence that Johnson's domestic political fortunes at that point were spiraling. So this gambit, which I describe, is long-standing. No live person invented this. Political figures throughout history have, from time to time, trifled with this. Sometimes it works, often it doesn't, but sometimes it does. It's a very seductive idea, and I think it's absolutely apparent in all of the political leaders you've just mentioned. Of course, what else unifies them except their absolutely dismal approval levels? Multiculturalism is a serious problem from the point of view of producing military power. One of the principal components of fighting power is the willingness of people to sacrifice. If you have a people which feels that they are losing their country, that they have been betrayed by their own elite, that the status quo in their homelands is invidious to them, that they are effectively under a kind of parasitic occupation, then their willingness to sacrifice economically, or not just and the willingness of parents to offer up their children to war, quite obviously, is very significantly compromised. So, one can see this again fairly obviously in recent events. The summer before last, for example, in the UK, we had the top military leadership talking about the potential need to bring back conscription, to bring back national service, which is a pretty big idea, caught the attention of, so it hit the news. The reaction of the public was a kind of incredulous, guffaw. Are you serious? The answer is no, and that's putting it politely. I think a more common reaction would have been F no. And we know this not just anecdotally, but because surveys were done at the time on people's attitudes towards this, and it was north of 80% said this is not a workable idea. We wouldn't fight for this. So it's a huge problem for the production of military power. What's quite clear in the US, as well as in the UK, and I will presume other countries in Western Europe, that this skepticism is very strong. And what you can see is it's producing a recruitment crisis. So all of these countries are drastically underproducing or under-recruiting relative to perceived requirement, hence discussion of conscription, just basically compelled recruitment. Why is that the case? As I've said, part of it is, basically changes in people's feelings about the status quo. And the places where those feelings have changed the most are also in those places where recruitment historically has been the most heavy. So in the case of the United States, particularly for the combat arms, recruitment in essentially poor southern white men has been a very important sector of the population to draw from. Of course, I mean I'm talking specifically about the attraction of people to combat arms under the fighting roles, has been historically very much focused on a few parts of the country where people are also the most alienated, the most likely now to express the kinds of ideas that you've... In the case of the UK, we also have a very severe military recruitment crisis, and it is no coincidence that the population which is now most alienated, that part of the population which feels itself to have been most abandoned, to have been most poorly treated by the status quo, is the white working class population. It's a weird proposition. If I say to you, it's now time to go fight for your country, your king and your flag, and you say, well, where were you guys when my sister was being, preyed on by Pakistani origin sexual torture networks? Where are you guys, with all this flag business, saying we should fight for our flag, and then at the same time, when we hang a flag from a street pole, you send the council around to cut it down? These are just obviously logically contradictory messages, and people are not so dumb as to miss the message. when it's repeated often enough. And it has been repeated often enough. People now get it. In terms of the ability to generate military power, if one understands that this very significant, probably the most significant factor in military power is the willingness to fight, then a population which feels itself to have been betrayed, to be in a mood of incipient revolt on account of feeling of having lost its country, having gone through now almost 2 generations of an educational program which tells them that their ancestors were horrible people, that the history of their country is one that needs to be repudiated, apologized, or indeed paid for. Yeah. These are not people that are going to obviously be impelled, be likely to volunteer to sacrifice, and why would they? When it comes down to it, I think Russia is not in a very strong position itself. Its demographic is dire. It has the same fertility reproduction crisis that affects most Western states, in some ways worse, in fact, because it's aggravated by poorer health, which means less longevity. So it's a country which is in some ways very wealthy, in the sense that, it's this giant treasure box of resources, of course. So it possesses in abundance things which other people want to buy, but it's always been affected by a problem typical of resource states, is that it's actually turns out to be quite difficult to turn resource wealth into general individual well-being. So, I think Russia fundamentally is a fairly troubled country in its own right. It has certain advantages which the West does not at this present stage. The main one being that Russia has a government which at least is nation-minded, that pursues the national interest, howsoever it defines that thing. But essentially, I think it's realistic about its potential, which is not rather limited. So I don't think Russia really wants to go to war with the West. I think it wants to be prosperous. It wants to be respected in its own area. I think its perception of what that area is probably a little larger than what it currently physically is. But I don't really think that their ambitions are as great as might be feared. Certainly they're far less ambitious than was the Soviet Union, which was a real threat, which was a real proper superpower. Your question, is there a disconnect between what is said in the media and reality? Then the answer is yes, there is a huge disconnect. The Western media, mainstream media, has been very happy, very compliant with repetition of government narrative around the threat from Russia. I don't think you could, we would struggle to find a mainstream newspaper or a television channel which would depart too much from government narrative on concerning the threat from Russia. To my mind, that is a departure from reality. It's a massive exaggeration of the threat. The question really ought to be, why is the media so compliant? Why have journalists seemingly given up on the idea that journalists are supposed to ask questions? The simple fact of the matter is that, by and large, the power elite of the Western world now is mostly colossally stupid. They're very ignorant people. They're very frightened people. And they're capable of all kinds of idiocy as a result. The irony, I think, is these are the same sorts of people who would talk about Russia employing weaponized migration. I mean, what else have you? How else would you label the situation you just described? That is literally weaponizing migration, not metaphorically weaponizing migration. These are ideas which emerge from that mindset I described earlier of regarding borders as anachronistic. Borders should, this is a mindset which says that borders ought to be transparent. A mindset that has a belief around essentially national identity is economically and socially retrograde. It's, I think, perfectly fair to say that the mindset of our elite is post-national in its orientation, and if your mindset is if you have a post-national mindset, then you're perfectly happy with, or indeed mass migration, or indeed see mass migration as a positive, which perhaps explains its acceleration. I think certainly explains the difficulty or the apparent difficulty which Western governments have had with reducing it. Their almost complete unwillingness to contemplate openly, to contemplate reversal. If on the one hand you want to reshape society by essentially deracinating the population, by erasing the kind of by making borders transparent, by introducing very large numbers, very rapid and at a very rapid rate, people into these societies who feel no national affinity towards it, then you will have a very reduced ability to get people to sacrifice for those things. If you are going to fight a big external war, and you're going to generate your army voluntarily, or even actually, or expect to have an army, even if conscripted into uniform, that would actually fight, the first pattern of behavior, or the first set of policies, contradicts the second. This is another aspect of the overall picture which we've been discussing, which is this isn't a logical system. It's not a system which is able to, which ultimately is going to be able to hold itself up on account of the kind of power and the kind of natural validity of the arguments of it makes, of its own propositions. It can't do so because its positions are contradictory. Some of them are contradictory and in a really egregiously insulting way. On the one hand, to declare that borders exist and are terrifically important for the purposes of migrating to France or wishing to buy another property, something, all kinds. There are many bureaucratic hoops for you to jump through. There are undoubtedly a whole range of fees which you would be required to pay. There would be a large number of competencies you would have to demonstrate. Probably the demonstration of those would also require you to pay fees and, to do all kinds of other things. So that is not easy. On the other hand, as you say, you can just get in a dinghy or get on a plane and throw your papers away. Arrive in Heathrow or wherever. You can declare yourself to be a 15-year-old, and all indications to the contrary. And the government will respond by putting you in a hotel, sending you to school. All kinds of things. This is obviously it's not just contradictory, it's deeply offensive to people who are required to play by the rules, to see those who do not play by the rules, are not required to play by the rules, and do not play by the rules, prosper in their home. That makes people angry. It's two-tier, or it's multi-tier, in fact. There are lots of polities that have multi-tier or two-tier justice systems. It's just none of them are democracies. You can't have a democracy that works that way. You can have an empire that works that way. The Ottoman Empire worked that way. We have imperial politics with an increasingly obviously threadbare robe of democracy wrapped around it. And it's a bit emperor's new clothes. You can see that is badly covered. It's increasingly difficult to tell, what's true from what's not, what has a kernel of truth and what has been exaggerated, and how much it's been multiplied. So I take a lot of that with a grain of salt. I think one has to. The reason that the status quo is crumbling is because so much of what has been decried as conspiracy has simply, obviously, and incontrovertibly now come to be understood as true. And again, if you think that, which you should, if you think that a high-functioning society essentially runs on trust foremost, then the situations like we have now, where trust is radically short supply, are simply pregnant with conflict. I think that the blowing up of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was the most cynical demonstration of realpolitik in my lifetime, probably going back further. I struggle to find historical parallels to a situation where one member of an alliance blows up the economic infrastructure of another member of the alliance in order to prevent said member from defecting, essentially. It feels very Soviet, in fact. It's the sort of thing that you might have expected to happen in the Warsaw Pact, not in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but there we are. Our politics have become extremely Soviet. The Germans had an economic model that made complete sense. Asian markets, Russian resources, German engineering, German products. Now it's got American resources, American energy, which is unviable for German industry, and a sanctions regime that requires Germany to punish those parts of the rest of the world which don't side with the West on the conflict with Russia. Well, the fact of the matter is most of the rest of the world doesn't care about that war. They're perfectly happy to buy Russian resources. So Germany's ended up with an absolutely tragic situation where its economy has become unviable. And I think it's a survival moment for them, which is why there is an irony to the bombing of Nord Stream, which, to be clear, I don't think was, it was not Russia, and I don't think it was Ukraine either. It was probably the United States. It was certainly a US-led operation, although who, in fact, pulled the trigger? Various friends and allies. But the irony of that is what it propelled into existence was exactly the thing that Mackinder invented geopolitics to warn against, which was this marriage of Russia and China, the emergence of this Eurasian compact. Marriage goes too far. It's not a marriage, but it is a kind of an economic and increasingly a strategic compact between Russia and China, which isn't very natural, actually. These are not natural allies. They've never been particularly natural allies, but they're very much propelled in the current circumstances into a compact which wouldn't have existed otherwise in the depth that it has done. That's massively strategically consequential for the world. It puts, and as I said, that's basically what Mackinder, if you could reduce Mackinder to 3 simple words, it would be don't do that. And that's what we've done. We've created this Eurasian compact. Ultimately, with respect to Germany, I don't know. I find Germany perplexing, as many people do. Germany is a country which is capable of huge feats, but it's also one which has some kind of national suicidal tendency, which is very, very perplexing. It's a country which seems capable every few generations of doing something, of basically leaping off a cliff, which is where they are now, I think. I suspect once the war in Ukraine is concluded by, I don't know exactly when that will be, but I think it's probably got another 1.5 to 2 years in it at the current rate. I think that Germany will be compelled to re-engage with Russia, and it will be and that will not be on Germany's terms, however. Whereas previously, I think it had very largely been on German terms. That situation will be reversed. And for those people who fear Russian ambition, fear Russian domination, that's a pretty credible fear that in the aftermath of what will be a rather historic strategic defeat for the West, for NATO, for the West generally, in Ukraine is going to be painful. It will have big economic consequences, it will have massive credibility consequences, and it will result in a much different balance between East and West Europe, one in which Russia is back in a position which it has enjoyed at certain parts of history of being much more powerful on much more powerful generally throughout the continent than it has been certainly for the last 30 years. That'll be very different. What's become very apparent is this, that highly financialized economies which on paper have high GDP, deindustrialized, highly financialized, not so-called knowledge economies, generate military power at a much less efficiently than do industrial powers, even archaic ones like Russia. A Russian weapon system is likely to cost a fraction, half, a third, a quarter, than an equivalent Western weapon system. There's a certain amount that comes out a bit more cut and dry than it should. From an export point of view, the differential is not probably that high. Russian weapon systems will be a little bit less expensive, but perhaps not on the order of a fifth or a third, but something less. Where I think is an interesting number is the cost to Russia of purchasing its own weapons, okay? Where it's really quite clear that that's a substantially smaller amount than the cost to the British government of buying its own weapon system, or the American government of buying its own weapons from its own industry. And there are many reasons why this might be, but I think a primary one would relate to the ownership and profit structure of Western defense industry versus the Russian defense industry, which on the whole is still in state ownership or very firmly tied to the state. So Western weapons are rather more expensive. They take a lot longer to produce. It is often argued that Western weapons are significantly more capable, more powerful, more accurate, more, whatever. The trouble with this thesis is the recent conflict has not really shown this hypothesis to be terribly valid. Many of the best performing weapon systems were essentially Soviet-derived systems, which have functioned quite well, certainly as well as equivalent Western systems. The war has been a piece of really astonishingly negative advertising for Western defense industry, which has gone through one wonder weapon after another, whether it's the Leopard tanks or the M1 tanks or MLRS and HIMARS missile systems, which each of which at one point or another has been trumpeted as a war-winning, balance-changing weapon, and then in reality has been handled pretty effectively and often rather dramatically with a lot of wasted, twisted, burnt-out wreckage on the Eurasian steppe, which is not good advertising for your main battle tank being marketed to the world at a cost of 30 million or whatever it might be. Then the other layer of complication which you added was with respect to China, of course, that it's not just that we have exported a lot of industrial production to China, it's that China has almost complete dominance in some of the most vital components. particularly as people probably understand in rare earth minerals, where it has a virtual monopoly. Rare earth minerals is a bit of a misnomer, I understand, because they're not all that rare. You can find them around. It's just they're very difficult and rather toxic to refine. So you can change that monopoly, but not quickly. It will take quite a while to reverse that. Given the relationship of rare earth minerals to the production of high-end electronics, it rather suggests that the ability of Western economies to generate new weapons and weapon systems, which now require high electronics in massive quantities, is obviously compromised if the Chinese decide not to provide said minerals. There are a number of other examples one could go through where the idea of a big industrial war with China is rather implausible. I mean, strategic. It could happen, of course, again through mass calculation or mistake, but implausible strategically. But I think one which really strikes me, and has many others, is specifically if you look at the Chinese dominance of shipbuilding relative to the United States. So the United States is quite obviously the world's preeminent military power. The U.S. Navy is also at the right now undeniably the most powerful navy in the world. But the base that supports that potential is staggeringly depleted. China's advantage over the United States today, specifically in the area of shipbuilding, is probably on the order of 200 to 1, if not slightly more than that. I think it is a bad idea for the United States to provoke a war with China. If Europe and Russia were to go to war with each other, I don't think there would be any winners in that. If it was a very long war and Europe was willing to give up a lot in terms of its economic model, basically there would be a lot of economic sacrifice. And I'm not sure if it's even plausible for countries which are so badly demographically skewed and also so heavily indebted to imagine that they could scale up their armed forces in the way that they did, for example, during the Second World War. It is possible for modern nation states to go from almost 0 to 100 in military terms very, very quickly. That, of course, being the kind of leitmotif of the American experience of the First and Second World War. Britain also very rapidly rearmed, as did many other countries. But I think that the scale of alteration in people's attitudes, or required alteration in people's attitudes in their economic well-being, would be so large as, to my mind, be hard to foresee. Not impossible, but I don't really see it. And when I hear talk, for example, of the impending German rearmament, which is obviously the most important part of your question with respect to a European-Russian conflict, I think, when is this going to happen? How is this going to happen? What are the Germans going to pay for this with? Someone's going to have to lend them the money at this stage. It seems a bit ambitious to think that your potential foe is also going to be lending you the money to do this. So it all feels to me rather implausible. But the bottom line really is, I think, if it came to a general continental scale conflict between the West or Western Europe and Russia, that it would inevitably escalate, and probably fairly rapidly, to a nuclear conflict. Europe doesn't have many cards to play. To judge by opinion polls, it doesn't have a population which is terribly inclined to fight for the status quo. It doesn't have a demographic which includes large numbers of healthy military-age males. It doesn't have economies that are equipped to rapidly retool to the production of military equipment. It is essentially vulnerable to the fact that irreplaceable components of contemporary military hardware are provided almost exclusively by China, which is likely to have a view on said conflict. Let's just say it has 5 fingers worth of very significant disadvantages. So it needs to wise up. And, well, that's probably understating it. But I suspect that as long as I think that the Israelis are in a very perilous strategic position. But they have some strengths, however. I think while Iran is a very powerful foe, potentially, and the ballistic missile threat is a real problem for them, I think my impression is, with respect to the rest of the Arab world, there is actually fairly surprising degree of willingness to not rock the boat much further. The Saudis are quietly cooperative. Syria is almost complete disaster that I would think has very little near to midterm potential to present a serious kind of state-level threat again. Likewise, Egypt, not a disaster like Syria, but a country which doesn't seem to have a very great desire to be distracted by a renewal of the interstate kind of conflict with Israel. So I think Israel's is in a perilous strategic position with respect to Iran. It has a completely unsolvable relationship with the Palestinians in Gaza, which it is bringing to a resolution essentially by turning Gaza into a place that's unlivable. But the major cost to Israel in that respect is reputational. It will destroy, or it has probably already destroyed, whatever reservoir of sympathy Israel possessed in the international sphere to this point, which wasn't much, to be honest, to be realistic. But it's probably calculated and sensibly that so long as it's got America on its side and its own population is unified and the Arab world is not unified against it, then it can make its way through. I don't want to imply that I think things are good for Israel, because I really don't. They've always been in a perilous state, let's put it that way. The entirety of Israel's national existence has been one where it has always had credible threats to its actual existence. I think that they're probably in the, let's say, or in the near term, able to manage that. In the long term, who knows? Things change, but I'm not as concerned by that as things closer to home.
Okay.
Or at any rate, I'm not Israeli, right?
Yeah,
Nor Palestinian, so I feel less strongly about it. When I say, the West's most important, the most serious threats to its security and well-being are internal and not external, that's a statement of relative severity. And so to be more specific, I think its internal peril is very severe. Its external peril is merely severe. Most of what I just described, where I feel less comfortable, or where I feel more comfortable, is describing essentially what are things which are structural in nature. When you talk about demographics or aggregate measures of trust, elite competence as expressed, so competence is hard to judge, but one of the ways you might judge competence is by the ability to get things done. If you look at the UK, for instance, and you see that the time scale for turning a single lane highway of 18 miles length into a dual lane highway is 30 years and not 9 months, you're bound to conclude that there is some level of competence failure that is causing this situation to exist. There are many, many examples that one could give of this. It doesn't seem to matter how many 100 billion we pour into the NHS, it just seems immune to improvement. It's like a patient which unfortunately has developed a very kind of antibiotic resistant illness. Doesn't matter how many ampoules of penicillin you pump in, you're not getting rid of that. The patient's not going to improve. So I'm very inclined to give credence to these cyclical and structural arguments about what happens to nations and civilizations, and it's rather unfortunate that we're in the period of the decline